Hi, my name is Mark Costa and I'm the Creative Director at Pixuma. And I'd like to talk to you about what is probably the world's biggest graphic design project. But first, let's look at what graphic design actually is. It's easy to think that it's simply the art of making things look pretty. Hopefully the end result is something attractive, but that isn't the primary aim. Imagine, for example, if car designers made fantastic looking cars, there wouldn't be much use if you couldn't actually use them as a car. That would be art rather than design. And some definitions might help here. Art can be defined as visual, auditory or performing works intended to be appreciated for their beauty or emotional power. However, design is the process of visual communication and problem solving using one or more of typography, photography and illustration. So what could graphic design entail? Well, it could be designing a new logo for a company, could be creating a new corporate brochure, a new easy-to-use website, or designing a map for an event. Graphic design at its heart is about clearly conveying information to your audience, and one famous example is the London Underground map. The design approach Harry Beck took in 1933 is still fundamentally in use today because he managed to see what previous people had not. He realised the actual locations of stations made little difference when you're underground. You just needed to know which one you wanted. Not only that, by doing away with the need for an accurately scaled map, he was able to show the entire network clearly, even in the crowded central London section. Now, the current tube map is pretty detailed, but it still works. In comparison, if it was created as an accurate scaled map of London showing all the geography, it wouldn't be anywhere near as user-friendly. Even when you blow up the central section, the other information simply gets in the way. And this is why graphic design is about problem solving. What information can be lost without losing the message? What information is critical and what is simply getting in the way or adding no value? So Harry Beck created an iconic design that could be used for the whole of London. But what about an even bigger project? What about designing the whole of the UK? What if you needed to create an entirely new language that anyone could learn easily? What am I talking about? The thing that you see and rely on every day and take for granted. Road signs. You might think road sign designs are obvious. How else would you design them? And that's quite easy to think when it's sitting in front of you. Quite different when it's a blank sheet of paper. Getting it wrong is far easier than getting it right, as is demonstrated in this video. Up until the 1950s, Britain's signage was a hodgepodge of styles and regulations and sometimes peculiar examples. For instance, this one. Any guesses what that might be? It's not entirely familiar to most of us. In fact, it is for a hospital. But what about this one? Well, it's quite obvious, of course. It's the torch of knowledge, therefore representing a school. Fairly obvious when you look at it. Now, with car ownership increasing, the government began a programme of redesigning the UK's signage. And in 1958, the new signs were used on the UK's first motorway, which of course is now known as, well, if you were thinking M1, you'd be wrong, because actually it's the M6. Britain's first motorway apparently was the Preston Bypass, which is now part of the M6. The entire project for the motorway signage was not given to an agency of 50 people. No, it was given to a graphic designer called Jock Kinnear and his business partner, who had previously been one of his students, Margaret Calvert. The constraints of the project were set with two simple questions. What do you need to know when travelling at speed, and at what distance do you need to know it? According to Margaret herself, style never came into it. And, as author Simon Garfield says, the last thing you want to do when you're driving along at 70 miles an hour is think, look at that lovely L or T. All you want to be told is where you are and where you turn. Therefore, one early decision was to create a new simple typeface for the job, and they conducted tests on reading text at various distances and speeds, using signs mounted on a roof of a car driven towards an audience. The brand new typeface, which is still in use today, called Transport, was born. For legibility at speed, they ditched the traditional method of using all capital letters, as it's thought this is harder to read quickly. With upper and lowercase characters, there is a shape which can be recognised much quicker as a pattern, as demonstrated by this Honda advert. Try that with capital letters, and I think you'll find it a lot harder to do it at that speed. But actually, where possible, they eliminated or dramatically reduced the reliance on text altogether. They created a set of icons that could be understood without the need for language, and they kept them as simple as possible, as adding any ornament would not add anything to the understanding them at speed. There is sometimes the need to have words, but they can normally be reduced to single words or very simple phrases to complement any imagery that is on the sign. My favourite thing they did, though, is the way they indicated roads, motorways, and especially roundabouts. They ditched the usual arrowhead style for something far simpler and did something very simple but very clever with roundabouts. To indicate the direction of travel, they could have indicated arrows on the outside, they could have put arrows on the inside, or they could have used chevrons. But actually, what they did is this. They simply put a gap in it. An idea which strips the diagram of unnecessary graphics and makes it easy to understand at the same time. Perfect problem solving. When something's done well, it's made to look easy and obvious. And of course they could have inherited or developed the existing signage, but their research meant that a complete overhaul was needed. Remember, design is about making things work. This is very nice in a village setting if the person reading it is on a horse or a bicycle, but at higher speeds the signs need to be simpler, larger and clearer. They also need to be further away from the actual junction to avoid sudden braking by people who are lost. Showing all the literal elements of a junction doesn't actually help indicate where the driver is allowed to go, as it's important to consider what can be omitted as to what should be included. Keep the message simple, clear and concise. Where possible, replace paragraphs of text with icons and symbols. Now, nearly 60 years later, the fundamental approach created by these two people is still in use all over the country, and the documentation that defines it runs to over 1,200 pages, defining everything from the angle the signs are placed, the font sizes, and how to avoid distracting scenery. The Mona Lisa doesn't come with a reference manual because the beauty of art is in the eye of the beholder. Great graphic design that performs its job well can also be beautiful, but its primary function is to work. I think that an entire visual language that has been used mostly unchanged for 60 years by an entire country and emulated all over the world is a great example of this. And don't forget that just because it looks easy, that doesn't mean it is. It's far easier to get it very wrong. Thank you very much.